It was a quiet evening on the outskirts of the city, where the hum of passing cars and the flicker of neon signs filled the air with an almost hypnotic rhythm. Amid the bustle of urban life, a figure sat motionless on the cold concrete sidewalk. She was wrapped in layers of tattered blankets, their colors faded and indistinct, blending her into the shadows like a ghost in the night. Her face, streaked with dirt, bore the tired lines of someone who had seen too much and spoken too little. To anyone passing by, she was just another homeless woman, a silent presence in a city that had long since stopped noticing people like her. The world moved around her, fast and indifferent, as if she didn't exist. A businessman hurried past, checking his watch without so much as a glance in her direction. A couple crossed the street to avoid walking too close, whispering to each other as they cast nervous glances her way. She didn't react. Her eyes remained fixed on the cracked pavement before her, as if she were staring into another world entirely. But there was something different about her, something you wouldn't notice at first glance. If you paused for just a moment, you might catch the faint glimmer in her eyes, a spark of intelligence that seemed out of place in her current surroundings. Her hands, though calloused and grimy, moved with a certain precision, folding a scrap of paper into a neat, deliberate square. What no one knew was that this woman, forgotten by the world, ignored by those who thought they had everything, was not at all who she appeared to be. Beneath the layers of worn fabric and dirt was a story waiting to be told, a truth so extraordinary it would leave everyone who crossed her path utterly speechless. The sun dipped lower on the horizon, casting long shadows across the street. A group of bikers roared down the road, their engines growling like angry beasts. They were loud and brash, their laughter cutting through the quiet like a knife. As they approached, one of them slowed, his eyes locking onto the woman. "Hey, lady," he shouted, his voice dripping with mockery. "Lose your castle." His friends erupted in laughter, their voices echoing in the stillness. The woman didn't respond. She didn't even look up. She simply adjusted the blanket around her shoulders, her movements slow and measured, as if she hadn't heard them at all. This only seemed to amuse the bikers further. "Ah, come on," another one jeered, leaning forward on his handlebars. "Don't be shy. What's a queen doing out here in the dirt?" More laughter followed, the sound cruel and hollow. To them, she was nothing, a target for their boredom, a prop in their performance of bravado. But if they had looked closer, they might have noticed the subtle change in her expression, the way her lips curved ever so slightly into a knowing smile. What they couldn't see, what no one could see, was the life she had lived before this moment. A life of power, wealth, and influence, hidden now beneath layers of disguise. She wasn't just a woman down on her luck. She was something else entirely. The bikers continued their taunts, tossing an empty soda can in her direction. It clattered to the ground near her feet, the sound sharp and jarring. She glanced at it briefly, then returned her gaze to the pavement, her expression calm and unreadable. "Come on, guys, let's go," one of them finally said, his tone tinged with boredom. "She's not even fun." With a final burst of laughter, they revved their engines and sped off into the night, leaving the woman alone once more. The street grew quiet again, the only sound the faint rustling of leaves in the evening breeze. She reached down and picked up the soda can, turning it over in her hands. For a moment, she seemed lost in thought, her eyes distant and unfocused. Then, with a flick of her wrist, she tossed it into a nearby trash bin, a movement so precise it might have seemed practiced. The faint smile returned to her lips as she leaned back against the wall, her eyes glinting in the dim light. She had seen this kind of behavior before, countless times. People who thought they were better, stronger, more important than those around them. People who underestimated her. She reached into her pocket and pulled out a small object, a coin, its surface worn smooth from years of handling. She held it up to the light, turning it slowly between her fingers. It was an unusual coin, larger than most, with intricate engravings that caught the glow of the street lamp. To anyone else, it might have seemed like a meaningless trinket. But to her, it was a reminder. A symbol of what she had lost and what she was about to reclaim. As the night deepened, the city seemed to close in around her, the air growing colder and the streets emptier. But she remained where she was, her posture relaxed, her expression serene. She was waiting. For what? No one could say. But one thing was certain, by the time the sun rose again, the world around her would look very different. And those who had laughed at her tonight? They would never forget the moment they realized just how wrong they had been. Appearances can be deceiving. And sometimes, the quietest person in the room is the one with the most power. The city didn't sleep, but its rhythm changed after dark. Street lights buzzed softly, casting halos of light on cracked sidewalks. The occasional car sped by, its headlights cutting through the shadows. But for the woman on the sidewalk, none of this mattered. She sat still, her back against the cold brick wall of an abandoned building, her mind wandering to places far away from this gritty corner of the city. She wasn't always here, not like this. Once, she had walked through marble hallways, her heels clicking against the polished floors. People had turned their heads when she entered a room, not because of how she looked but because of who she was. Her name had meant something then. It carried weight, power, and prestige. Emily Dawson wasn't just a name, it was a brand, a legacy. But here, on this cold stretch of pavement, she was no one. The bikers had no idea who they had mocked. How could they? To them, she was just another statistic, another forgotten soul swept aside by the relentless machine of society. They didn't see the sharpness in her gaze, the strength in her quiet demeanor. They couldn't have imagined that beneath the dirt-streaked skin and frayed clothes lay a mind that had once orchestrated million-dollar deals and made decisions that shaped industries. Emily had learned long ago how to make herself invisible. It was a skill she had never imagined needing, but one she had perfected over the past few months. She moved through the world like a shadow, unnoticed and unremarkable. And yet, she saw everything. She had watched the bikers as they approached, their loud laughter filling the air like the roar of an approaching storm. She had noticed the way their leader, a burly man with a thick beard and a leather jacket emblazoned with a skull, carried himself with an air of unchecked arrogance. She had seen how the others followed his lead, their laughter forced, their bravado an act. People like them were predictable. She had met their kind before in boardrooms and on golf courses, in charity galas and exclusive clubs. They were the ones who mistook loudness for power, who believed strength came from dominance rather than respect. As they had taunted her, Emily had remained still, her face expressionless. It wasn't fear that kept her silent, it was calculation. She had nothing to prove to them. Their words, their mockery, meant nothing. They were fleeting, like the buzz of a fly. Annoying, perhaps, but ultimately insignificant. But that didn't mean she had forgotten. Emily's memory was sharp, her mind a vault of details. She had noted the logos on their jackets, the license plates of their motorcycles, the way the leader's voice carried just a hint of insecurity beneath the bluster. She had filed it all away, not because she intended to act on it at least, not yet, but because she knew the value of information. Information had always been her greatest weapon. It was what had built her empire, what had allowed her to rise from nothing to everything. And now, it was what kept her one step ahead in this strange, new life she had chosen. The truth was, Emily wasn't here by accident. She hadn't been forced onto the streets by some cruel twist of fate or a series of bad decisions. She was here because she wanted to be. It was all part of a plan. To anyone else, that might have sounded absurd. What kind of millionaire, no, billionaire would choose to live like this? To endure the cold, the hunger, the endless stares of pity or disdain. But Emily had never been like anyone else. She had spent her entire life defying expectations, breaking barriers, and rewriting the rules. And now, She was rewriting her own story. Emily's journey to this moment had been anything but ordinary. She had built her fortune from scratch, starting with nothing but a borrowed laptop and an idea. Over the years, her company had grown into a global powerhouse, her name synonymous with innovation and success. She had been celebrated, envied, even feared. But success came with a cost. The higher she climbed, the more isolated she became. The people around her saw her not as a person but as a means to an end. They wanted her money, her connections, her influence. They didn't care about her as Emily, the woman who loved books and quiet evenings by the fire, who dreamed of making the world a better place. And then there were the betrayals. Trusted friends who turned out to be opportunists. Colleagues who stabbed her in the back for a chance at her position. Even family members who saw her as nothing more than a walking bank account. By the time Emily reached the pinnacle of her success, she realized how hollow it all felt. She had everything she had ever dreamed of, yet she felt more alone than she had when she started. That was when she made her decision. She didn't tell anyone, not her staff, not her advisors, not even the small circle of friends she still trusted. One day, she simply vanished. She left behind the skyscraper office, the penthouse apartment, the designer wardrobe. She emptied her calendar, cancelled her meetings, and walked away from the life she had spent decades building. To the outside world, it was a mystery. News outlets speculated endlessly about her disappearance. Was it a mental breakdown? A kidnapping? A calculated move to evade the public eye? No one knew. And that was exactly how she wanted it. The street lights flickered as Emily sat on the sidewalk, her mind wandering through the memories of her old life. She wasn't nostalgic, she had no desire to return to the world she had left behind. But she couldn't help but marvel at the contrast. Back then, she had been surrounded by luxury soft beds, fine wine, private jets. Now, her days were filled with cold nights, cheap coffee, and the constant hum of the city around her. Yet, in some ways, she felt more alive than she had in years. She had spent the past few months observing the world from a new perspective. She had seen the kindness of strangers, the resilience of those who had nothing, the quiet dignity of people who refused to let their circumstances define them. She had also seen the cruelty, the indifference, the way society turned a blind eye to those who needed help the most. It was a harsh education, but one she had embraced. And then, there were moments like tonight, the bikers, the jeers, the laughter. Moments that reminded her why she had chosen this path. Because for every taunt, every insult, every sneer, there was an opportunity. An opportunity to show the world that strength didn't come from wealth or power or status. It came from within. Emily glanced down at the small coin in her hand, its surface catching the light. She had carried it with her since the day she left her old life behind. It was a token, a reminder of who she was and who she wanted to become. As the night deepened, Emily leaned back against the wall, her expression calm and serene. The bikers were gone, their laughter fading into the distance. The street was quiet once more, the city settling into its late-night rhythm. She knew they would be back. People like them always came back, drawn to the thrill of dominance, the illusion of control. But Emily wasn't worried. Because the world might see her as a homeless woman, forgotten and discarded. But by the time this chapter of her story was finished, they would know her for who she truly was. And they would never underestimate her again. The night was settling deeper into the city streets. The air was thick with the smell of exhaust and fast food, the kind of atmosphere that seemed to soak into everything. Emily sat quietly at her usual spot near the old bus stop, her shopping cart parked beside her. Inside it was an odd assortment of items: blankets, crumpled newspapers, an old book with its spine nearly worn away, and a rusty tin cup. She kept her head low, her hands folded neatly in her lap. From a distance, she was just another figure blending into the chaos of the city, a piece of the background noise that no one bothered to notice. But Emily noticed everything. The rumble started low, like distant thunder rolling in from the horizon. It grew louder, a mechanical growl that rattled the ground beneath her. She didn't need to look up to know what it was. The bikers were back. They came every few nights, their motorcycles roaring through the streets like predators staking their claim. There were 5 of them, always the same group. Leather jackets adorned with patches, chains dangling from their belts, and the ever-present sneer on their faces. They weren't a gang in the traditional sense, not the kind that made headlines for serious crimes, but they thrived on intimidation. Their game was simple: find someone weaker, humiliate them, and move on. Emily heard them before she saw them. The sharp laughter, the revving engines, the way they seemed to fill the air with their presence. They turned the corner and spotted her immediately, their leader pointing her out with a jerk of his head. "Look who's still here," he said, his voice loud enough to echo off the nearby buildings. His name was Vic, a tall, burly man with a thick beard and a scar running across his left cheek. He always spoke first, always led the charge. The others followed him like shadows, their loyalty born more out of fear than respect. The group slowed their bikes, forming a semicircle around her. Their headlights cast long, exaggerated shadows on the ground, trapping her in their glow. "Hey, lady!" Vic called out, his tone dripping with mockery. "Still waiting for Prince Charming to pick you up?" The others burst into laughter, their voices harsh and grating. One of them, a wiry man with a crooked grin, reached into his jacket and pulled out a crumpled soda can. "Here," he said, tossing it at her feet. The can hit the ground with a hollow clatter, rolling to a stop against her worn shoes. "Buy yourself something nice." Emily didn't move. She kept her head down, her hands steady. Her face was obscured by the hood of her jacket, but if they had been paying attention, they might have noticed the faintest twitch at the corner of her mouth, a hint of a smile, so subtle it could have been imagined. Vic leaned forward on his bike, narrowing his eyes at her. "What's the matter? Cat got your tongue?" he taunted. He revved his engine, the sound splitting the air like a roar. "Come on, say something." The others joined in, their voices blending into a chorus of jeers. "Maybe she's mute," one of them shouted. "Or maybe she's just dumb." "Leave her alone," a voice called from across the street. It was an older man, dressed in a janitor's uniform, standing near the entrance of a convenience store. He didn't move closer, but his tone carried a note of warning. The bikers turned toward him, their expressions hardening. "Mind your own business, old man," Vic shot back, his voice low and dangerous. The janitor hesitated, then retreated into the store. The bikers turned their attention back to Emily, their confidence restored. "Guess you've got no one to stand up for you, huh?" Vic said, his voice full of mock sympathy. "No friends, no family. Just you and that junk pile you call a cart." He reached out and gave the cart a shove with his boot, knocking it over. Its contents spilled onto the ground: a blanket, a few cans of food, a small metal box that clattered loudly as it hit the pavement. Emily finally moved. Slowly, deliberately, she reached out and began gathering her things. She picked up the blanket, folding it carefully, and placed it back in the cart. She didn't look at them, didn't react to their taunts. Her calmness seemed to unnerve them. Vic frowned, leaning back on his bike. "What's your deal, huh?" he asked, his tone sharp. "Think you're too good to talk to us?" Still, she said nothing. One of the others, a younger man with a nervous energy, shifted uncomfortably. "Maybe we should just go, Vic," he said quietly. "Go?" Vic snapped, turning on him. "She's just sitting there like she owns the place. She needs to learn some respect." Emily paused in her movements, her hand hovering over the metal box. Slowly, she picked it up, her fingers brushing against its smooth surface. She held it for a moment, her grip firm, before placing it back in the cart. For the first time, she looked up. Her eyes, dark and piercing, met Vic's. The group fell silent. It wasn't the look of fear or anger they had expected. It wasn't the hollow gaze of someone beaten down by life. It was something else entirely, something that made even Vic hesitate for a split second. But the moment passed, and the tension broke as one of the others let out a nervous laugh. "Man, she's crazy," he said, trying to lighten the mood. Vic shook his head, forcing a grin. "Whatever," he said, revving his engine again. "She's not worth the time." The bikers turned their bikes, their laughter echoing as they sped off into the night. Emily watched them go, her expression unreadable. She adjusted the blanket around her shoulders and leaned back against the wall, her hands resting lightly on the cart's handle. The janitor from across the street stepped out of the store, glancing in her direction. He hesitated, then crossed the street cautiously. "You okay, miss?" he asked, his voice kind but wary. Emily nodded, her lips curving into a faint smile. "I'm fine," she said, her voice soft but steady. The janitor looked at her for a moment, then nodded and walked away. As the city grew quiet again, Emily reached into her pocket and pulled out a small object, a coin, its surface worn smooth. She turned it over in her fingers, the motion familiar and calming. She wasn't angry. She wasn't afraid. She had seen men like Vic before, countless times. They were loud, brash, and overconfident. And they always underestimated her. Emily tucked the coin back into her pocket and leaned back against the wall. The night stretched on, the city humming softly around her. She knew this was far from over. The bikers would be back. People like them always came back. And when they did, they would learn the truth about the woman they had mocked. Appearances can be deceiving. The streets grew quieter as the bikers' roars faded into the distance. Emily sat motionless for a moment, the faint glint of headlights disappearing around the corner. She closed her eyes briefly, listening to the stillness that followed. It wasn't silence, not here, not in the city. The faint hum of life was always present, distant sirens, muffled conversations, the rhythmic tapping of raindrops beginning to fall on the pavement. But to Emily, it was calm. She exhaled slowly, adjusting the cart by her side. The toppled contents were neatly arranged once more, her hands having worked instinctively to restore order. She reached down and brushed her fingers over the metal box, making sure it was still intact. Her grip lingered on it for just a second longer than necessary. This box, like the coin in her pocket, was more than it appeared. It contained her most important possessions. Not valuables in the traditional sense, no jewels, no cash, no gold. To anyone else, it would have seemed like a collection of random trinkets. But to Emily, every piece inside it was a key, a clue, a fragment of her larger plan. The plan the bikers had just unknowingly stumbled into. The bikers had settled a few blocks away, their laughter echoing under the overpass where they gathered. They had taken this spot as their own, the graffiti-covered pillars and crumbling asphalt serving as a makeshift clubhouse. Vic sat on the edge of a concrete barrier, a cigarette dangling from his lips. The others surrounded him, their motorcycles parked in a haphazard row. "Did you see her face?" one of them said, snickering as he gestured wildly. "Didn't even flinch. Like she didn't care at all." "She's probably used to it," another chimed in, his voice dripping with disdain. "You know how these types are. They're too far gone to even get mad." Vic exhaled a puff of smoke, his eyes narrowing. "I don't buy it," he muttered. The group turned to him, their laughter quieting. "What do you mean?" the nervous younger one asked, shifting uneasily on his feet. "There's something about her," Vic said, flicking his cigarette to the ground. "She didn't react. Not even a little. Most people would have yelled, cried, done something. But her? Nothing. So what? The wiry man with the crooked grin said, shrugging. Maybe she's just numb to it. Who cares? Vic didn't respond immediately. He leaned back, his arms crossed, his mind working through the brief encounter. Something about the way she had looked at him, calm, unbothered, almost amused, gnawed at him. She's hiding something, he said finally. The group exchanged glances, uncertain how to respond. Vic's instincts were rarely wrong, but this seemed far-fetched. Hiding what? One of them asked cautiously. She's just some homeless lady. Maybe, Vic said, his tone laced with doubt. He stood up, his boots crunching against the gravel. Or maybe not. The rain had picked up, a steady drizzle soaking the city streets. Emily adjusted the hood of her jacket, shielding herself from the chill. She didn't mind the rain, in fact, she welcomed it. The city seemed quieter in the rain, more reflective. She had no intention of moving from her spot tonight. This corner had become her base of sorts, a place where she could observe, gather information, and piece together the puzzle she was working on. Her eyes drifted to the sidewalk across the street, where a group of teenagers huddled under an awning, sharing a single umbrella. Their laughter was soft, their voices blending into the rhythm of the rain. It was moments like this that reminded her why she had chosen this path. The simplicity, the rawness of life as it truly was. Stripped of all the layers of wealth and power, the world was both harsher and more beautiful. But she couldn't forget her purpose. Her hand brushed against the coin in her pocket once more, its familiar weight grounding her. This wasn't just about escape or reflection. She had a mission, one that required her to remain unnoticed for as long as possible. And yet, tonight, the bikers had noticed her. Emily's lips curved into a faint smile. It was a small complication, but not an unwelcome one. If anything, it added another layer to her plan. Vic and his crew returned to the bus stop 2 nights later. The rain had cleared, leaving the air crisp and cool. The city seemed brighter, the street lights casting sharp reflections on the wet pavement. Emily was there, just as they expected. She hasn't moved an inch, Vic said as they approached, his voice low and curious. What's she waiting for? The others followed his lead, their bikes forming the same semicircle around her as before. Still here, huh? Vic said, dismounting his bike. He took a step closer, his boots splashing in a shallow puddle. You must really like this spot. Emily didn't respond. She adjusted the blanket around her shoulders, her movements slow and deliberate. Vic crouched in front of her, his eyes scanning her face. You're not scared of us, are you? He asked, his tone half mocking, half curious. She met his gaze, her expression calm. Should I be? The question hung in the air, surprising both Vic and his crew. The wiry man let out a nervous laugh. She's got jokes now, he said, nudging the younger one beside him. But Vic wasn't laughing. He studied her closely, his mind racing. You talk like you've got nothing to lose, he said finally. Emily tilted her head slightly, a faint smile playing on her lips. Maybe I don't. The tension in the air was palpable, the bikers exchanging uneasy glances. Vic stood up abruptly, his hands clenched into fists. Let's see what you've got in that cart, he said, reaching for the handle. Emily's hand shot out, gripping the cart firmly. Her strength was surprising enough to stop Vic in his tracks. Don't, she said, her voice low but commanding. Vic hesitated, caught off guard by the sudden shift in her demeanor. For a moment, no one moved. Then, with a scoff, Vic let go, stepping back. Whatever, he said, trying to mask his unease. Keep your junk. The group lingered for a moment longer before revving their engines and riding off into the night. Emily watched them go, her hands still resting on the cart. She knew this wasn't over. If anything, it was just beginning. The encounter had left the bikers rattled, though none of them would admit it. Vic,